Thank you very much for coming. So what I'm going to be talking about today is levelling up. And I'm going to be putting that in sort of international perspective. But most of you, because I know what the LSE is like, it's a very international place, most of you will probably be wondering what on earth levelling up is in the sort of first place. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a sort of, introduction there. So let me kick off with what levelling up is. Now most of you will know this guy. You will know him very vaguely, I suspect, from the media. For those of you who haven't been in the UK very long, he was our Prime Minister relatively recently. He was 2 Prime Ministers ago, maybe 3 Prime Ministers ago, I'm not sure. I haven't checked the news this morning, so I don't know. But he's a sort of, he was essentially a sort of political opportunist. He was a sort of, became Prime Minister in 2019, called an election. And one of the things which he noted when he wanted to sort of win this election was he noted that there was a series of essentially there was a series of seats in the north of England which he could potentially win through a sort of political strategy where he targeted investment at them, told them that if they voted for him, there would be, he would help them out. This was called the Red Wall. In 2019, for various reasons, the Red Wall turned blue. He won a load of seats and essentially he became Prime Minister. And when he was on the steps of Downing Street, having won this election, he said, what we're going to do is we are going to unite the country, because we were pretty fractious at the time after Brexit debates, and he said we are going to level up. We're going to level up the country, unify the country in some ways. Now, past Conservatives, politicians, had also talked about levelling up a little bit. There's a famous politician called Alan Clark in the 1980s. And this politician, he was a very posh British politician, he said that levelling up was an issue because it meant he had to pay his servants more, okay? And this is a different genre of levelling up. This isn't about paying your servants more. This is about some form of economic development across the country which is going to benefit people. So this is where the idea of sort of levelling up comes from. Now, for some people, this is simply a sort of political piece of opportunism. It's a label, a brand you can put on policies to win support for them. You can build a railway in some way, you can build a railway going from sort of London to the north of England. You can put a label on it and say levelling up, and everyone will think this is what Boris Johnson's government is doing. They're levelling up the country. They are doing something for me. So there's a sort of cynical and I think entirely correct view that this is a piece of political opportunism. But there's another view, which is actually when we talk about levelling up, we're talking about this bigger issue, which is not just an issue in the UK, but which is an issue internationally. Across the OECD, about making sure that there are fewer regional inequalities between different parts of each of these countries. So in Germany, they talk about the sort of long legacy of sort of the East-West divide. In France, it's a major issue. Of course, in the UK, levelling up's been a huge issue, but we see similar things, we see similar sort of issues raised right across the advanced world, not least in the United States. And the United States is a great example here because some colleagues of mine, in particular a colleague of mine, Andres Rodriguez-Posay, talks about the revenge of the places that don't matter. Places which were lagging somehow had a sort of populist revolt which then led to sort of challenges in the political system and the rise of Trump. And people have made some sort of quite big claims of the idea that actually what was happening here was that the political system, regional inequalities were somehow causing an instability in the political system. And this instability in the political system was deeply problematic. So, I've been at LSE for almost 20 years now since I did my master's degree. This is quite painful for me. I started my master's degree here in 2004. Now, it's in that entire time period, I have basically been doing research on what is now called levelling up. So I've been talking about how you raise incomes in lagging parts of the country, how you sort of equalise incomes between, in the UK we talk about a relatively poorer north and a relatively richer London and the southeast. And throughout that whole time, I have been talking about the idea that, somehow these technocratic solutions, the idea, all we need to do is work out how to do it, and then we will do it, okay? Then we will sort of somehow sort of level up. But I want to acknowledge some LSE funding here, which is LSE who gave me funding to do a series of policy impact work, a lot of it with Max Herbertson, who's here. And I remember vividly one of the first meetings we had with a senior politician. And I went into this meeting and I said, right, here is my list of technocratic things you should do. These are the things you should do. And suddenly regional disparities will sort of come about. And basically what she said was, look, Neil, it's not just about whether you can do these things, what we should do to level up. What really matters here, the real problem, is how I get people to vote for the stuff which will help us level up. So one of the things I'm going to be talking about today is not so much how we level up, but I'm going to talk about how we level up and how you might get people to sort of vote for it. And I'm inspired partly by my children, because my children, I was talking about this presentation with them, and I said, I've been at sort of LSE for 20 years, and so my children said, well, first of all, my children said, you're a very old man, because 20 years is sort of unimaginable period of time for them. But then the children said, well, look, Neil, if you've been studying leveling up for 20 years, surely you know how to do it by now, right? Surely you know how to do it. So they posed a sort of slightly different question. I can't remember which of my kids it was, Shiv or Kendall or Roman. But they said, rather than why should we level up, they said, why don't we level up? And I think this is quite an interesting question, which I'm going to be sort of talking about today. And I'm going to give you three sort of things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the problem that actually regional disparities are sort of complicated. We need to think about how we sort of measure regional disparities as much as anything. I'll talk about some new ESRC-funded research on measurement. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of economics. This is the London School of Economics. There's lots of experts on this. I'll talk a little bit about it. But then I'm also going to talk about some of the politics of levelling up and how that translates into a sort of political system, from a British political system into essentially a series of policies for levelling up which are really not too good. So let me start off by saying one of the problems we have when we're looking at sort of regional disparities in this country is that it's very hard to measure them. So this is from The Economist, wonderful, newspaper, magazine, whatever you want to call it. It's a famously misleading graph from The Economist where they looked at regional disparities across the OECD. So you see Britain comes out of this and looks like it's very, very regionally unequal. Other countries, Sweden does look pretty well. United States, Germany looks slightly more unequal than the United States according to this measure. France is sort of there as well. South Korea less so. Italy, even a country such as Italy, which is famed for its regional divides, looks much, much, much better than Great Britain according to this sort of measure. Now the problem with measures like this is that they're highly dependent on the spatial scale at which you measure things. So if you look at this, what they've done is essentially taken sort of roughly inner London or inner West London, bits which are sort of financial servicey, bits where people commute in, bits where essentially relatively few people work there, but lots of people book their company profits there. And these places in a country like the United Kingdom, they will always look very, very productive. Whereas if you look at a country with sort of smaller cities like Germany, these sort of disparities look less bad. They look less bad, partly because they'll be looking at a sort of different spatial unit. And the example here we have is the United States. So anyone who's been to New York or Washington, DC or San Francisco will see that there are huge spatial divides between rich parts of the United States and less rich parts of the United States. But because they're using state-level data in this sort of comparisons, these aren't really sort of apparent. So the first thing which we do in this data is try and take something which is really exciting like this. So we take a sort of exciting but sort of slightly misleading piece of work, and we're trying to come up with something which is, frankly, a little bit more careful, a lot more boring as a piece of analysis, but which is a little bit truer and gets us a little bit closer to the picture. So, I need to acknowledge the ESRC for funding this work. It's a huge sort of team effort. To give you a sense of the size of the team on this project, I'm not even the first Lee on the co-author list. There's someone else who's got the surname Lee as well. And what we try and do is we try and make comparable spatial units. So we're saying spatial units, we're going to look at functional local labour markets over a longer time period. And that helps us because it lets us say, this is what's happened over the last sort of 30 or 40 year period. Consistent wage measures. And real income is coming soon. And coming so soon that when I agreed to give this talk, I thought I would have the real income figures, but I don't have them yet. So what do we find? We find that contrast this, so this is one measure of spatial inequality focused on wages. And it's the variance of log average local labour market wages in 2019 or the nearest year. And what we show is that actually, by far the most unequal country we study is the United States. And to some extent, this is unsurprising, right? Because we know from the big picture studies, done by people like the World Inequality Database, we know that the United States is probably the most the most unequal of these countries anyway. Canada looks pretty bad. I think we have to take that with a pinch of salt. The sort of figure goes up and down. The United Kingdom is certainly worse than Germany, and it's a lot worse than France, but it's nowhere near as bad as the United States. So when we hear stories about the US being the UK being the worst spatial inequality in the advanced world, I think we need to take that with a big pinch of salt. We also look at what happened. How did this change over time? The United States is the sort of orange line on the top there. You can see it's been increasing for a long period of time. France is the blue line. The black line is Germany, and the United Kingdom is the red line. And what you can see here is that the red line, the United Kingdom line, actually, when it was in the 1970s, early 1980s, the UK was more spatially equal than France. It's only in the 80s and the 90s that things started to spread out. And there's two main explanations for this in the literature. One is the change in the industrial structure of the economy. We had a very rapid deindustrialization, and we shifted to services. On the one hand, this was like a big policy success. On the other hand, it was a big policy failure because some places lost out there. It's got sort of, strong sort of, it's got important lessons for other places going through similar sort of transitions right now. But the other thing which happened in that period was that our institutions changed. Our institutions of wage setting, of wage coordination, we went from having quite a lot of collective bargaining coverage in the economy, and all of that went. So basically, what we see is that the 80s and 90s were the periods when the regional divides really came about. And actually, if you look at the red line from about 2005, spatial inequality in this sense has been declining. If you take London out of this, things look much, much flatter. London still is sort of outstripping everywhere else. The superstar city story seems to be certainly true. I can't present that data yet, but something's definitely happening there. So what we see is that actually big patterns of sort of spatial inequality. What's driving this? It's not spatial inequality of low incomes. This is the 10th percentile of income. So this is people who are 10th percentile of the bottom. You see there's very little variation in where low earn, there's very little inequality in how much low earners earn. But if you look at the 90th percentile, then you see there's a big disparities. Because this is what we see. Basically, spatial wage inequality is driven by high earners. London is rich because that's where the rich people live. It sounds obvious to say that, but it's important to sort of reflect on that. These are the people who have benefited from economic change, and these are what have been driving changing patterns of spatial inequality across many of these countries. Now, some of you will be saying, actually, this is just one measure of inequality, and you're absolutely right. It's the measure I happen to have. But if you look, you can see sort of different measures of inequality give sort of slightly different results. This is from my colleague Henry Overman and Xiaowei Zhu at the IFS. And you look at GVA per capita on the left-hand side. That's what I gave you earlier. This gives you like a big extreme. Once you start to look at hourly wages, there's a much more truncated distribution between different parts of the UK. Employment, even more truncated. Employment rates are very equal relatively equal across the country, particularly for sort of high-skilled workers. And one thing to point out here, right, is that before housing costs household income, and after housing costs household income on the right-hand side here, there's a slight truncation of the distribution once you account for housing costs, but it doesn't do as much as we might expect given the sort of high housing costs you have to pay if you're in London and the southeast. So I've laid out some sort of patterns there. Now I'm going to tell you some of the things which are driving that. First one is this sort of argument between economic change and institutions. So I've already said that, right, there's been manufacturing decline, growth of sort of service industries in London and the sort of greater southeast, but at the same time we've seen this sort of decline in, wage institutions, wage setting, wage coordination has sort of declined, and you can sort of see this in the sort of literature. Economic change has come in, it has benefited the type of industries we had in the south, the consulting, real estate, finance, many of the industries which a lot of sort of LSE graduates will go on to go and work in. At the same time, deindustrialization has been harmful to places outside of London and the sort of outside of London and the southeast. London used to be a manufacturing city in the 1950s. By the 1970s, it wasn't, so it lost it, but its economy had managed to adapt over that period. And one of the reasons its economy had adapted was because of what we call agglomeration economies. the benefits of being located in a big city. You can share resources, you can match jobs with workers, you can match suppliers and so on. And because of that, you end up with this process where top graduates from outside of the, even graduates who go to universities, like LSE, want to stay in London and benefit from the sort of agglomeration economies in the city. But this can only ever be a partial explanation. These economic explanations, they're important, but they're only partial, because we see other countries like France, which face sort of issues, which face, come at it with similar urban structures, but end up with quite different sort of outcomes. So my contention today is that actually one of the things we sort of disagree on, one of the things which is important, is policy. And we've completely, and particularly the politics, has not driven a sort of pro-levelling up policy in this country for some time. So this is, Max did this. It's like a huge number of basically what it shows you is the different agendas, the agendas of economic development, which we've seen in the UK. As an old man, I can see large number of different sort of economic development agendas, some of which are genuine local government reforms, most of which are sort of buzzwords or branding or sort of ways in which the sort of government has decided to try and make people feel like they care about sort of big cities or whatever. So we've seen this huge and endemic policy churn where local areas, first of all, what they're expected to do changes a lot. The money they have to do has been sort of like changing has been sort of quite difficult for them to do anything which they want to independently. And also, we've had this problem that, basically our policy system here has been very, very bad at dealing with a sort of adjustment to sort of shocks. One reason for that is that I tried to find some evidence that people in different parts of the country felt very differently about concern for the economy. I don't know if this is necessarily the best way of doing it, but it didn't seem like there was sort of big regional variation where people in certain parts of the country were more likely to vote for their local economy than elsewhere. But what we do know that this is a UK problem and not a problem they have in some other countries, such as sort of, Germany, for example. So the best OECD economies, or the most regionally equal OECD economies, they tend to have a series of sort of features to them. They have to have institutions which can take a long-term outlook, which can tailor policy to local circumstances, and have the budgets, the freedom, the flexibility to sort of make strategic choices and do what they need to. Lobbying's important. There's a reason why it's important that sort of local government can go to national government and say, you're not getting this right, rather than, as we have in the UK case, national government tends to just talk down to sort of local government. And the other thing which we lack in this country is any sort of incentives to accommodate growth. If the tax base is largely, if tax goes to Whitehall and you don't see much of it, you're much less likely to be keen on voting for growth than you would do in other countries. And this is problematic because people will always say to you, well, look at the Germans managed to level up. They managed to go from having massive regional inequality to much lower regional inequality. And yes, sure, but it was very expensive, and the people, it had cross-party support. Like, people wanted it, and because people wanted it, they were willing to sort of vote for those large incentives. Whereas in the UK, we have a tough budget constraint, tough choices, and the median voter, if you said to them, do you want a better NHS or do you want a stronger local economy? My guess is the median voter, so not the average, the person who's going to sort of swing the votes, my guess is they're more concerned about sort of social care or the NHS than they care about their local economy specifically. Partly because, they don't have the incentives to sort of, to sort of do, to benefit from it. They don't have the incentives to encourage growth. If we're going to concrete over, Basingstoke, then what do the residents of Basingstoke gain? And you can see this when you look at sort of marginal seat patterns. You don't need to, I won't sort of linger on this because I'm running out of time, but basically the percentage of 2019 marginal seats in each income ventile, and actually there's no sort of consistent pattern. I struggled to find any consistent pattern or any consistent sort of evidence which showed that there was a sort of areas which were low income areas were specifically likely to be marginal. Of course, they're likely to lean one way or the other politically, but they're not going to be the marginal seats which politicians are going to sort of try and attempt, with the exception of what happened in sort of 2019. So, let me conclude with what I've talked about. I've talked about levelling up, this UK government policy agenda. It's a big policy agenda, certainly for sort of geeks like me, and hopefully for geeks like you as well, if I can say it like that. And one of the reasons for that is that the UK has pronounced spatial inequality. And we've seen a series of sort of populist votes, which people have suggested is about spatial inequality. And while I started off by saying, well, the UK spatial inequality is not as bad as it is in the United States and all that sort of stuff, I mean, there's the counter argument to that is, does it matter? Because you'd still want to do something about it. If you're going to grow the UK economy, you need to grow the UK economy, you need to sort of somehow do something in sort of lagging regions, particularly in the UK. The sort of big opportunity is that we have a series of big cities, not London, which are punching below their weight, have poor levels of sort of infrastructure, and any feasible route to national growth would go through these sort of cities. But let me just conclude by saying that, I think part of the problem here is an economic problem. We have shifted from a sort of manufacturing economy to a service economy that has benefited certain parts of the country, but the real problem here has been that our institutions, and particularly our political institutions, have not been well adjusted to sort of adapt to that as they might have been in other countries. Thank you.